Daniel Harper stood in the center of the Grand Council chamber and felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon him. The crystalline walls of the Viridian Prime Assembly Hall reflected light in ways that made his human eyes hurt. Around him sat representatives from 47 different species, each one claiming thousands of years of spacefaring history. Daniel had been on this world for 3 months now, serving as Earth's first ambassador to the Galactic Council. And in all that time, he had never felt more alone than he did right now. He cleared his throat and began speaking into the translation device clipped to his collar. The device would carry his words to every delegate in their own language. Daniel had rehearsed this speech 100 times on the journey here, but now that the moment had arrived, his carefully prepared words felt inadequate. He spoke anyway because he had no choice. The fate of billions might depend on what happened in this room today. The Krell Dominion was coming. Daniel's voice echoed through the chamber as he explained what human intelligence had discovered over the past 6 weeks. Fleet movements in the Outer Rim. Encrypted communications intercepted by Earth's listening posts. Refugee ships fleeing from border worlds with stories of entire systems going dark. The pattern was clear, to anyone willing to see it. The Krell were mobilizing for war on a scale the galaxy had not witnessed in 3 centuries. Daniel pulled up holographic displays showing the data Earth had collected. Red markers indicated Krell fleet positions. Blue lines traced projected invasion routes. Every analysis pointed to the same conclusion. The inner worlds were the target, and the attack would come within 2 months. He urged the Council to act now, to mobilize their defensive fleets, to prepare their worlds for what was coming. Unity and preparation were their only hope of survival. The Varan Chancellor was the first to respond. His skin was a pale blue that darkened when he was annoyed, and right now it was nearly purple. He spoke in a tone that dripped with condescension. The humans were new to the galactic community, he said. They did not understand the complexities of interstellar relations. The Krell had been troublesome for generations, yes, but they could be managed through proper diplomatic channels. This was how civilized species conducted themselves. A ripple of agreement moved through the chamber. The Solix representative, a being that looked like a living collection of golden light, added her own dismissal. Human military technology was primitive compared to Council standards. Their ships were crude. Their weapons were simple, kinetic launchers and basic energy projectors. What could such a young species possibly know about galactic-scale warfare that the Council did not? Daniel felt his frustration rising but kept his voice steady. He was not claiming military superiority. He was sharing intelligence that Earth had gathered through methods the Council apparently did not employ. Human listening posts were scattered throughout the outer system specifically because Earth knew it was vulnerable. Humanity watched and learned because they had to. The data did not lie, regardless of who had collected it. The Athari delegate, a reptilian being named Vec, who had been kind to Daniel during his time here, spoke next. His tone was gentler than the others, but his message was the same. The Council had maintained peace for 300 years through diplomatic engagement and mutual respect. There had been conflicts, of course, but nothing that could not be resolved through negotiation. Perhaps the humans, coming from a world with such a violent history, were simply seeing threats where none existed. It was understandable, given their background. Daniel wanted to argue further, but he could see it was pointless. The Council members had already made up their minds before he started speaking. To them, humanity was a curiosity at best, and an annoyance at worst. They had granted Earth Observer status in the Council only because protocol demanded it for any species that achieved faster than light travel. But respect? That would take centuries to earn, if the Council's attitudes were any indication. One by one, the delegates voiced their positions. Some were dismissive. Others were openly mocking. A few remained silent, which Daniel supposed was better than outright hostility. But none of them supported his call for military preparation. The vote, when it came, was 45-2 against taking any action based on human intelligence. Only Vec and one other delegate had voted in Daniel's favor. As the session ended and delegates began filing out, Daniel stood alone in the center of the chamber. 3 months of careful diplomacy, countless meetings and cultural exchanges, all of it meant nothing in the face of the Council's arrogance. They had decided long ago that humanity was too young and too primitive to teach them anything. Now people were going to die because of that pride. Daniel made his way back to the human embassy, a small building on the outskirts of the capital city. His staff was waiting for news. Communications. Officer Linda Pierce looked up hopefully as he entered, but Daniel just shook his head. She did not need him to explain what that meant. She immediately began preparing an encrypted message for Earth. Within the hour, Daniel was speaking directly to General Kate Morrison at Earth's Strategic Command Center. The conversation was delayed by several seconds due to the distance, but the general's frustration came through clearly. She had been afraid this would happen. The Council had ignored warnings about the Krell before, and each time they had been lucky. Their luck was about to run out. Daniel asked what Earth would do now. General Morrison's response was immediate and decisive. If the Council would not prepare, then humanity would. She was recalling all military units to home system. Defense platforms would be activated. The fleet would be mobilized, and she was bringing in Colonel Ryan Blake from the outer colonies. Blake had experience fighting pirates in the frontier systems. He knew how to win against superior numbers. The general had one more order. Daniel was to stay at his post and keep feeding intelligence to Earth. When the Krell attacked, the Council would panic. They would need help, and when they finally came asking for it, humanity would be ready to answer. Not because the Council deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. Daniel ended the call and walked to the window of his office. Viridian Prime was beautiful in the evening light, its crystal spires catching the rays of the setting sun. Somewhere out there, beyond the peaceful skies and the comfortable civilization, a storm was gathering. The Council could not see it yet, but Daniel could. He had tried to warn them. He had done everything in his power to make them understand. Now all he could do was wait and hope that humanity would be enough to make a difference when the darkness finally arrived. The Krell Dominion struck at dawn on the water world of Aqualis, and within 6 hours the planet's legendary defenses lay in ruins. The attack came without declaration or warning, just as Daniel Harper had predicted. 300 warships dropped out of dark space and opened fire before the Solix defense fleet could even raise their shields. The elegant vessels that the Solix had built to showcase their technological superiority proved useless against an enemy that had spent centuries perfecting the art of destruction. Commander Zeth of the Solix fleet sent one final transmission before his flagship exploded. The message reached the Galactic Council 40 minutes later. By then, Aqualis was already burning. Orbital bombardment had shattered the protective domes of the underwater cities. Millions of civilians were fleeing into the deep ocean trenches. But the Krell were methodical. Their scanning arrays tracked every refugee ship, every escape pod, every desperate attempt to reach safety. Nothing escaped. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session within 3 hours of receiving Zeth's message. The same chamber where they had dismissed Daniel's warnings, now filled with panicked voices and desperate suggestions. The Varan Chancellor, his skin now pale with fear instead of dark with arrogance, tried to maintain order, but his authority had evaporated. Delegates were shouting over each other, some demanding immediate military response while others insisted on attempting diplomatic contact with the Krell. Vec, the Athari delegate who had been one of the few to support Daniel's warning, stood and called for silence. When the chamber finally quieted, he spoke with a calmness that surprised everyone. They had made a terrible mistake, he said. They had allowed 3 centuries of peace to make them soft and unprepared. The human ambassador had tried to warn them, and they had laughed. Now they were paying the price for that arrogance. The question was not who to blame, but what to do next. The military assessment was grim. The Council's combined fleets numbered nearly 2,000 ships, but they were scattered across dozens of systems. Most were patrol vessels designed for peacekeeping and piracy suppression, not warships built to face a dedicated military force. The Krell had brought 3,000 heavy combat vessels, all of them hardened by generations of constant warfare. Even if the Council managed to gather their full strength, the tactical analysis suggested they would lose. As the Council debated, the Krell continued their advance. The mining colonies of Epsilon Reach fell next. Then the agricultural worlds of the Verdant Chain. Each attack followed the same pattern: overwhelming force, no communication, total destruction of military assets, followed by systematic subjugation of civilian populations. The Krell were not interested in negotiation or even in understanding their enemies. They wanted territory and resources, and they would take them through force. Daniel Harper watched the reports coming in from his office in the embassy. Each new disaster confirmed what he had known for months. The Council had waited too long, and now their people were dying. Linda Pierce worked beside him, coordinating with Earth and trying to track Krell movements. The invasion force was splitting into multiple prongs, each one targeting key systems. It was a brilliant strategy designed to prevent the Council from concentrating their forces. 3 days after the fall of Aqualis, Daniel received the communication he had been expecting. The Varan Chancellor's image appeared on his screen, and the change in the man was shocking. The proud leader who had dismissed humanity's concerns now looked old and defeated. He spoke without the condescension Daniel had endured for months. The Council needed help. They needed ships, soldiers, tactics, anything Earth could provide. He was not demanding or expecting, merely asking. Daniel did not gloat or remind the Chancellor of their previous conversation. There would be time for recriminations later, if anyone survived. Instead, he simply told the Chancellor that human forces were already mobilizing. General Morrison had anticipated this request and had begun moving assets into position 2 weeks ago. The first human ships would arrive within 4 days. The Chancellor thanked him with genuine gratitude that seemed almost painful for him to express. After the call ended, Linda asked Daniel how he felt about the Council, finally acknowledging they had been wrong. Daniel considered the question for a moment before answering. He felt tired, he said, and sad, because being right about this meant that millions of people had already died, and millions more would die before this was over. On Earth, General Kate Morrison stood in the Strategic Command Center and watched the display showing fleet positions. The Valkyrie, her flagship, was already en route with 400 vessels. Another 100 ships were being loaded with supplies and would follow within 2 days. It was everything Earth could spare, without leaving the home system completely defenseless. She knew it might not be enough, but humanity had to try. Colonel Ryan Blake arrived at the command center fresh from the outer colonies. His hair was longer than regulations allowed, and he had a scar across his left cheek from a pirate raid 6 months earlier. Morrison did not care about his appearance. She cared about his record. Blake had fought 17 engagements against superior forces and won 14 of them. He understood how to use inferior resources against stronger enemies. That was exactly what the Council needed now. Morrison briefed Blake on the situation. The Krell were advancing on multiple fronts. Council forces were in disarray. Human ships would arrive soon, but they were technologically inferior to both the Krell and the Council fleets. Earth's advantage was not in their weapons or shields, but in their tactics and their willingness to fight in ways that civilized species found distasteful. Blake listened carefully and asked pointed questions about Krell capabilities and Council weaknesses. Captain Lisa Martinez was preparing her destroyer squadron for departure when she received new orders. Instead of joining the main fleet, her 30 ships would operate as a rapid response force. Their mission was to hit Krell supply lines and force the enemy to divert resources to rear security. It was dangerous work that would leave them isolated and vulnerable. But Martinez had volunteered for this assignment. She understood that sometimes the best way to help the main force was to cause chaos behind enemy lines. The Krell continued their methodical conquest. 5 more worlds fell in the week following Aqualis. The Council managed to evacuate some civilians, and even won a minor victory at the Helix Nebula, where a combined force surprised a Krell scouting group. But these were temporary bright spots in an increasingly dark picture. The Krell were winning, and everyone knew it. Daniel Harper received regular intelligence updates from Earth's network of listening posts. Human operatives had infiltrated several neutral systems and were observing Krell operations firsthand. The reports painted a picture of an enemy that was confident to the point of arrogance. The Krell had fought dozens of campaigns against various species, and they had won every one. They expected this war to follow the same pattern: initial shock and overwhelming force, followed by collapse of enemy resistance and eventual surrender. What the Krell did not expect was humanity. They had dismissed Earth as a primitive backwater whose technology was centuries behind current standards. Intelligence reports showed that Krell commanders did not even consider human forces a threat worth planning for. That mistake, Daniel thought, was going to cost them dearly. Because while humans might lack advanced technology, they had something the Krell had not encountered before. They had experience fighting wars where survival itself was in question. The human fleet emerged from warp space, 300,000 kilometers from Thornax Station, and immediately deployed into combat formation. Admiral Christopher Hayes stood on the bridge of the Valkyrie and watched his tactical display fill with icons. 500 human warships had just arrived in a system where the Krell were preparing to crush the last major Council defensive position in the sector. The station itself was already damaged, its shields flickering under sustained bombardment from Krell heavy cruisers. Hayes opened a channel to all ships and kept his message brief. They had trained for this moment for 3 weeks during the journey here. Every captain knew their role. Every crew member understood what was at stake. The Council was watching to see if humanity could deliver on its promises. More importantly, thousands of civilians were sheltering in Thornax Station, and they would die if this defense failed. That was all the motivation any human needed. The Krell responded to the human arrival with what appeared to be casual disdain. Their fleet of 400 warships had been systematically destroying Council forces for 2 months. These newcomers were smaller than Council vessels, and their energy signatures suggested primitive power systems. Krell. Tactical doctrine called for a standard engagement pattern. Heavy ships would advance to energy weapon range while fighters would screen against missiles. It was a formation that had worked 1,000 times before. What happened next caught the Krell completely off guard. The human fleet did not advance in a neat formation, the way Council forces always did. Instead, the destroyers led by Captain Lisa Martinez broke into 3 separate squadrons and accelerated at speeds that seemed reckless. They were not heading for the Krell main force, but rather angling toward the flanks. Behind them, the Valkyrie and other heavy cruisers began launching fighter craft. Hundreds of small spacecraft poured out of the human carriers and formed up in loose formations that seemed chaotic compared to the precise patterns Council fighters used. The Krell adjusted their formation to meet this unconventional approach, but they were already reacting instead of dictating the flow of battle. Martinez's destroyers reached missile range and launched everything they had. Thousands of projectiles streaked toward the Krell fleet. The Krell point defense systems engaged, destroying most of the incoming missiles. But the humans had not expected those missiles to reach their targets. They were a distraction. While the Krell were focused on the missile swarms, human fighters closed to attack range. They did not engage in elegant dogfights or attempt to match the superior maneuverability of Krell interceptors. Instead, they simply overwhelmed the enemy with numbers and aggression. 3 human fighters would gang up on a single Krell craft, sacrificing 1 or 2 of their own to guarantee a kill. It was brutal and wasteful by Council standards, but it was devastatingly effective. Colonel Ryan Blake was leading a Marine company aboard one of the assault transports when the order came. A Krell heavy cruiser had taken damage from massed fire, and its shields were down. Blake's transport, along with 5 others, broke formation and burned hard toward the crippled vessel. The Krell tried to withdraw, but human destroyers cut off their retreat. Blake's transport slammed into the Krell ship's hull and breaching charges blew open an entry point. Fighting inside a ship was something Council forces almost never did. It was considered too dangerous and too unpredictable. But humans had been boarding enemy vessels since the age of wooden sailing ships. Blake's Marines poured into the Krell cruiser wearing combat armor and carrying weapons designed for close-quarters fighting. The Krell crew, expecting to die in space combat, found themselves fighting, room to room, against an enemy that seemed to have no fear. The battle for Thornax Station lasted 18 hours. Wave after wave of attacks crashed against the Krell formation. Human ships that lost shields did not withdraw. They pressed forward, trading armor for position. When ammunition ran low, captains resorted to ramming damaged enemy vessels. The Krell had superior technology and better training, but they were fighting an enemy that simply would not stop. Admiral Hayes coordinated the human fleet from the Valkyrie's bridge, while simultaneously managing communications with the surviving Council forces. The Athari commander, a female named Shara, had been holding the station's close defense with her remaining ships. When the humans arrived, she had been preparing to evacuate. Now, working alongside human destroyers, her forces found new purpose. Hayes showed her how to concentrate fire instead of spreading it evenly. He demonstrated how overwhelming one enemy ship was better than damaging three. Captain Lisa Martinez lost half her squadron in the first 4 hours of combat. Her own destroyer took severe damage when a Krell plasma cannon burned through the port side armor. But she kept fighting, redirecting damaged ships to suicide runs against high-value targets. When her weapons officer reported they were down to 15% ammunition, Martinez ordered her ships to use their mass as weapons. 3 human destroyers rammed a Krell battleship, creating an opening that allowed Shara's forces to destroy it. The turning point came when Colonel Blake's Marines captured the Krell cruiser's engineering section. Instead of simply destroying the ship from within, Blake had a different idea. He contacted Admiral Hayes and proposed using the captured vessel as a weapon. Hayes understood immediately. The human Marines set the cruiser's reactor to overload and then piloted the ship directly into the center of the Krell formation before evacuating. The resulting explosion destroyed 4 enemy vessels and damaged a dozen more. The Krell fleet commander made his decision based on calculations that had served the Dominion well for centuries. His forces had eliminated 32% of the human fleet and inflicted severe damage on another 20%. By standard tactical doctrine, the enemy should surrender or retreat, but when the Krell issued the traditional demand for surrender, the human response was a fresh wave of missile fire and a message from Admiral Hayes that contained only 2 words: "Come on." After 18 hours of continuous combat, the Krell fleet withdrew. They had lost 30% of their ships and gained nothing. Thornax Station was battered, but intact. The human fleet was in terrible condition, with half their vessels too damaged to fight effectively. But they had held. For the first time since the invasion began, the Krell had been stopped. Admiral Hayes walked through the Valkyrie's corridors after the battle and saw the cost of victory firsthand. Damage control teams were working to patch hull breaches. Medical bays were overwhelmed with wounded. The ship's doctor told him they had lost 800 crew members. Across the fleet, the numbers were similar. 12,000 humans had died defending a station in a system most of them could not have found on a map 3 months ago. General Kate Morrison received Admiral Hayes's after-action report at Earth Command. She read through the casualty figures and felt the weight of every name. But she also saw something else in the report. The Krell had retreated. The Council forces had learned from watching human tactics. And most importantly, the galactic community now understood that humanity was serious about defending them. Morrison issued new orders. More ships would be sent. More Marines would be deployed. The war was far from over. Daniel Harper received word of the victory at Thornax Station while meeting with the Galactic Council. The Varan Chancellor read the report aloud to the assembled delegates. When he finished, the chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Vex stood and began what humans would call a slow clap. Others joined in. Within seconds, the entire council was standing and applauding. It was not just appreciation for military success. It was recognition that humanity had earned its place among them through blood and sacrifice. Colonel Ryan Blake and his surviving Marines were transferred to a council medical station for treatment. The Athari doctors were amazed by human resilience. Blake had taken 3 plasma burns during the boarding action, but refused treatment until all his soldiers were cared for. The Athari had never encountered this kind of loyalty before. They asked Blake why humans fought so hard for people they barely knew. Blake's answer was simple. Because it was right. Because someone had to. Because the strong have a duty to protect the weak. The Athari doctor recorded that conversation and sent it to the Council's cultural archives. The Battle of Thornax Station changed everything about how the Galactic Council approached the war. Within 2 weeks, human advisors were embedded with Council fleets across a dozen systems. General Kate Morrison personally traveled to Viridian Prime to coordinate the combined military effort. She brought with her a simple message. Humanity would fight alongside the Council as equals, not as subordinates or saviors. This was everyone's war, and victory would require everyone's contribution. Commander Jake Sullivan received his orders while his frigate squadron was refueling at a border outpost. He was to take 12 ships into the Crescent Nebula and disrupt Krell's supply lines. The mission was considered borderline suicidal by Council standards. The nebula's dense gases played havoc with sensors and communications. Ships could pass within kilometers of each other and never know it. But Sullivan saw opportunity where others saw danger. If human sensors were blind, then Krell sensors would be equally useless. Sullivan's squadron entered the nebula using a navigation technique that made his Council liaison officer physically ill. Instead of plotting a careful course around the densest gas clouds, Sullivan went straight through them. The frigates emerged exactly where Sullivan wanted them, directly in the path of a Krell supply convoy. The enemy ships were running with minimal shields to preserve power for their cargo haulers. They never had a chance. Sullivan's attack destroyed 8 supply vessels and 2 escorts before vanishing back into the nebula's concealing gases. On the jungle world of Verdania, Major Ashley Cooper was teaching a different kind of warfare. The Krell had occupied this world 3 weeks ago and were systematically stripping its resources. The local population, a species called the Rin, were peaceful farmers who had no concept of organized resistance. Cooper and her 200 infantry soldiers were changing that. She taught them how to hide in their own forests, how to strike without warning and disappear, how to make the occupiers afraid of every shadow and suspicious of every sound. The Rin were quick learners once they overcame their initial reluctance to fight. Cooper showed them that resistance did not mean suicide charges against superior forces. It meant patience and persistence. A supply depot burned here. A patrol ambushed there. Communications, equipment, sabotaged. Nothing dramatic by itself, but cumulatively, it forced the Krell to divert thousands of troops to occupation duty who could have been fighting on the front lines. At the Red Giant Cluster, Admiral Christopher Hayes was planning something unprecedented. Intelligence reports showed that the Krell had concentrated a major fleet at the cluster's central system. They were using it as a staging area for their next offensive. Hayes wanted to attack it, but not with human forces alone. He convinced the Athari commander Shara to commit her ships to a joint operation. It would be the first time Council and human forces fought together in a coordinated offensive rather than desperate defense. The planning sessions revealed just how different human and Council approaches to warfare were. Shara's tactical doctrine emphasized minimizing casualties and preserving forces for sustained operations. Hayes's doctrine emphasized achieving objectives regardless of cost. They argued for hours before finding a compromise. The combined fleet would use Council technology for the approach and initial strike, but human tactics for the close-in fighting. Neither side would be completely comfortable, but both sides would learn. Lieutenant Commander Paul Dixon was not a combat officer. He was a training instructor who had spent his career teaching new recruits basic tactics. Now he found himself on a Council world giving lectures to military officers who had graduated from academies older than human civilization. The first few sessions were awkward. The Council officers were polite but skeptical. What could this primitive species teach them about warfare? Dixon started by showing them recordings from Thornax Station. He paused the playback at key moments and asked what the Council officers would have done. Their answers were always sensible. and based on established doctrine. Then Dixon showed them what the humans actually did. The council officers began to understand. Human tactics were not elegant or efficient, but they were unpredictable. And in war, unpredictability was often more valuable than superiority. Sergeant Claire Stevens was part of a ground defense force preparing the world of Helion for a possible Krell assault. The locals were terrified. They had seen what happened to occupied worlds. Stevens spent her days teaching civilian volunteers how to use weapons, and her nights helping them dig defensive positions. She was exhausted and homesick and scared, but she never let the volunteers see that. They needed her to be strong, so she was strong. One evening, a young Helion male asked Stevens why humans were willing to die for worlds that were not their own. Stevens thought about it for a moment before answering. She told him about Earth's history, how humans had fought countless wars over territory and resources and ideology, how they had nearly destroyed themselves multiple times, and how they had finally learned that the only thing worth fighting for was each other. Now, humanity was applying that lesson on a galactic scale. They fought for Helion because its people mattered. It was that simple and that complicated. The counter-offensive at Red Giant Cluster began at midnight station time. The combined fleet of 300 human ships and 400 council vessels dropped out of warp space in attack formation. The Krell had expected reinforcements to their staging area, not an assault. Their defensive posture was all wrong. Hayes and Shara exploited that mistake ruthlessly. The first wave of attacks targeted Krell sensor arrays and communications relays. The second wave went after their heavy ships, while they were still trying to organize a response. The battle lasted 9 hours and ended with a complete human and council victory. 3 occupied worlds in the cluster were liberated. The Krell lost over 200 ships. More importantly, they lost their forward staging area, which pushed their entire offensive timetable back by months. The cost was high. 60 human ships were destroyed, and 100 council vessels suffered major damage. But for the first time since the war began, the Krell were retreating instead of advancing. General Morrison watched the battle reports coming in from Red Giant Cluster and allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. The war was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. The Krell were no longer invincible. The council forces were learning to fight effectively, and humanity had proven that courage and determination could compensate for technological disadvantage. The question now was whether they could sustain this effort long enough to actually win. Daniel Harper continued his work as ambassador, but his role had evolved. He was no longer asking the council for anything. Instead, he was facilitating cooperation between human and council forces. He helped resolve cultural misunderstandings and smoothed over conflicts that arose when very different species tried to work together. It was tedious work that would never make the history books, but it was essential. Wars were won not just through battles but through the countless small efforts that made large operations possible. Commander Sullivan's raids in the Crescent Nebula became legendary. He destroyed supply convoys, ambushed patrol groups, and generally made the Krell paranoid about operating anywhere near the nebula. Other human commanders adopted his techniques. Soon, the Krell found themselves forced to heavily escort even routine supply runs. This drained resources from their combat fleets and slowed their offensive operations. Major Cooper's guerrilla campaign on Verdania achieved something remarkable. The Krell occupiers became so frustrated with constant attacks that they withdrew from the rural areas entirely and concentrated their forces around the main cities. This allowed thousands of Rin civilians to escape into the wilderness. Cooper organized these refugees into a resistance network that would continue to harass the occupiers for months. When liberation finally came, the Rin credited Cooper with saving their species from extinction. The Galactic Council formally adopted human tactical doctrines into their military training. Officers who once dismissed humanity as primitive now competed for positions in human-led units. The Council's military academy on Viridian Prime created a new curriculum based on lessons learned from working with humans. It was a revolution in military thinking that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. But the cost continued to mount. Every victory came with casualty reports. Every liberated world meant another list of names to add to the memorial walls. General Morrison read every report and approved every deployment, knowing that some of those people would not come home. It was the burden of command, and she carried it without complaint. But late at night, alone in her quarters, she wondered how many more would have to die before this war finally ended. The intelligence breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A Rin resistance fighter on Verdania captured a Krell communications officer and brought him to Major Ashley Cooper's camp. The prisoner was badly wounded and knew he was dying. In his final hours, he spoke freely about things that would have been classified under normal circumstances. He told Cooper about Obsidian Station, the massive fortress in the Obsidian sector where the Krell War Council coordinated the entire invasion. "Destroy that station," he said, "and the invasion would collapse." Cooper immediately transmitted this information to General Kate Morrison. Within hours, human intelligence operatives across multiple systems were working to confirm the details. Everything checked out. Obsidian Station was real, heavily defended, and absolutely critical to Krell operations. Morrison called Admiral Christopher Hayes and asked him a simple question. Could it be done? Hayes looked at the tactical data for a long moment before answering. Yes, but it would cost them dearly. The planning took 3 weeks. Every detail had to be perfect, because they would only get one chance at this. The Krell would defend Obsidian Station with everything they had. Morrison assembled a joint task force of 500 ships, 200 human, and 300 council vessels. It was the largest combined fleet ever gathered. Command would be shared between Admiral Hayes and the Varan Fleetmaster, a grizzled officer named Korath who had learned to respect human methods. Daniel Harper watched the preparations from Viridian Prime and felt the weight of what was about to happen. This battle would decide the war, one way or another. If the attack succeeded, the Krell invasion would fall apart. If it failed, the combined losses would leave Council space defenseless. He sent a message to Earth that night, addressed to his sister. He told her he was proud to represent humanity among the stars. He told her that whatever happened next, it had been worth it. He did not say goodbye, but the implication was clear. The fleet assembled at a staging area just outside the Obsidian sector. Captain Lisa Martinez's destroyer squadron had been rebuilt after the losses at Thornax Station. She stood on her bridge and looked at the tactical display, showing 500 friendly icons. It seemed like a lot, until she considered what they were about to face. Intelligence estimated the Krell had over 800 ships defending Obsidian Station, plus the station's own formidable weapons. Colonel Ryan Blake's Marines were spread across 30 assault transports. Their mission was to breach the station itself and destroy its command center from within. It was a job that required getting through the Krell fleet first, then surviving the station's point defenses, then fighting through corridors filled with enemy soldiers. Blake briefed his people honestly. The survival rate for this operation was estimated at less than 30%. Not a single Marine asked to be reassigned. Admiral Hayes gave the order to advance at 0600 station time. The joint fleet entered the Obsidian sector in formation. Human and council ships intermingled in a pattern designed to maximize their combined strengths. The Krell detected them immediately and began moving to intercept. What followed was the largest space battle in galactic history. 800 Krell ships against 500 Allied vessels, with the fate of billions hanging in the balance. The initial exchange was devastating for both sides. Krell plasma cannons tore through Allied shields, while human missile salvos overwhelmed Krell point defenses. Council energy weapons burned holes in enemy armor, while Krell fighters swarmed Allied carriers. Ships died on both sides within the first 10 minutes. Hayes watched his tactical display and saw icons winking out with horrifying speed. But the plan was working. The Allies were pushing forward, trading casualties for position. Martinez's squadron executed the most dangerous part of the operation. They broke from the main formation and burned straight toward Obsidian Station, drawing fire from dozens of Krell ships. Half her squadron was destroyed in the first 5 minutes. Her own destroyer took hits that killed 30 crew members and left the starboard weapons offline. But she kept going because the marine transports were counting on her to clear a path. The Valkyrie took a direct hit from a Krell battleship that penetrated the bridge armor. Admiral Hayes was thrown from his command chair and felt his left arm break. Emergency crews pulled him to safety while his executive officer took command. But Hayes refused medical treatment. He had the crew rig a temporary command station in engineering and continued directing the battle from there. Later, when asked why he did not evacuate to another ship, Hayes said he would not ask his people to do anything he was not willing to do himself. Blake's transports reached the station's outer hull after Martinez's squadron sacrificed itself to the last ship. Only 3 transports survived the approach, carrying less than 400 Marines instead of the planned 1,000. Blake did not hesitate. He ordered the transports to breach, and his Marines poured into the station. The fighting inside was brutal. Every corridor was defended. Every intersection became a battlefield. But the Marines kept advancing because they knew the entire fleet was depending on them. General Morrison watched the battle unfold from Earth Command and felt helpless. All she could do was receive reports and wait. The casualty figures were staggering. 70 human ships destroyed in the first hour, 100 council vessels gone, thousands dead, and the battle was only beginning. She thought about all those people who had trusted her leadership and wondered if she had sent them to die for nothing. The turning point came 6 hours into the battle. Blake's Marines reached the station's command center and planted explosive charges on the primary reactor controls. But the charges were damaged during the fighting and would not detonate remotely. Someone would have to stay behind and trigger them manually. He ordered his surviving Marines to evacuate while he stayed behind. Sergeant Claire Stevens refused to leave. She had followed Blake through 3 campaigns, and she was not abandoning him now. Blake and Stevens held the command center against waves of Krell soldiers, while the other Marines fought their way back to the transports. They lasted 20 minutes before Blake was badly wounded. Stevens dragged him to cover and prepared to trigger the charges. Blake told her to go. That one person could finish this. Stevens looked at him and smiled. She told him that she had joined the military because she wanted to matter. She wanted to do something that meant something. This was it. She would not trade this moment for anything. Stevens triggered the charges, and Obsidian Station exploded in a flash that could be seen across 3 star systems. The blast destroyed the command center and damaged the station's structural integrity. Secondary explosions rippled through the massive fortress as power conduits overloaded and ammunition stores detonated. The Krell fleet, suddenly, without central coordination, began to falter. Admiral Hayes, still directing the battle from the Valkyrie's makeshift engineering command post, saw the opening and took it. He ordered all ships to concentrate fire on the disorganized Krell formation. The Allied fleet, despite its heavy losses, surged forward. Council ships and human vessels fought side by side with a coordination that would have seemed impossible months ago. The Krell tried to regroup, but without Obsidian Station guiding them, their command structure collapsed. The battle ended after 9 hours of continuous fighting. The Krell fleet broke and scattered, individual ships fleeing in all directions. Some fought to the death. Others simply jumped to warp speed and ran. The Allied fleet was too damaged to pursue effectively. They held the battlefield and the ruins of Obsidian Station, but the cost had been terrible. 140 human ships destroyed, 170 council vessels gone, nearly 40,000 Allied personnel dead or missing. Daniel Harper received the news at the embassy and immediately contacted Earth. The Krell invasion was over. Without their command center, and with their fleet shattered, they would retreat to their own territory. The Council was saved. Humanity had kept its promise. But Harper felt no joy in the victory. He had met many of the people who died today. He had attended memorial services for others who fell in earlier battles. The price of survival had been almost too high to bear. General Morrison walked through Earth Command and looked at her staff. They were exhausted but trying to smile. The war was over, and they had won. But Morrison saw the cost in their eyes. Every person in that room had lost friends or family in this conflict. 30,000 humans had died defending people they had never met. Morrison called for a moment of silence. Then she began the work of bringing the survivors home. 6 months later, Daniel Harper stood once again before the Galactic Council. The chamber had been repaired, but scars from a Krell raid that nearly succeeded were still visible on the walls. The Council formally inducted humanity as a full member with all rights and privileges. But more than that, they offered something that could not be written into law. Respect, understanding, recognition that wisdom and worth were not measured in centuries but in character. The Veron Chancellor gave a speech, acknowledging the Council's failure to heed human warnings. He spoke about arrogance and the danger of assuming that age equals wisdom. He talked about the 30,000 humans who died defending worlds they had never seen. And he promised that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. Monuments were being erected across Council space, bearing human names alongside those of other species who gave their lives. General Morrison attended the ceremony on Viridian Prime and accepted the Council's gratitude on behalf of Earth's military. But she insisted on one thing. The memorial on Viridian Prime would list every name, not just the heroes or the officers, but every single person who died, from Admiral Hayes, who survived his injuries and was recovering on Earth, to Sergeant Stevens, who died triggering the charges that destroyed Obsidian Station. Every name mattered. Every sacrifice counted. Admiral Hayes watched the ceremony from his hospital bed on Earth. His arm was healing, but doctors said he would never have full mobility again. Hayes did not care. He was alive, and the war was over. That was more than many could say. He thought about the crews he had commanded and the ships he had lost. Later, he would visit the families of those who died under his command. He owed them that much. Daniel Harper remained as ambassador to the Galactic Council. His role had changed from advocate to partner. The Council sought human input on military reform. They asked for advice on defensive strategies. They wanted to learn from humanity's experience. Harper worked 18-hour days, helping to build new relationships and establish protocols that would prevent future disasters. It was exhausting work, but it mattered. The galaxy had learned an important lesson, though the tuition had been paid in blood. Youth was not the same as ignorance. New voices deserved to be heard, and sometimes the most important truths came from the most unlikely sources. The Galactic Council would never again dismiss a warning simply because it came from a younger species. That change in attitude, Harper thought, might be humanity's most important contribution to the galaxy. On Earth, in a small park in Geneva, workers unveiled a memorial listing the names of the 30,000 who died in the war. The monument was simple black stone with white letters. At the top, an inscription read, "They stood for those who could not stand for themselves." People came from all over the world to see it. Some left flowers. Some left messages. All came to remember that when darkness threatened, humanity had not hesitated or calculated the cost. They had simply done what was right.